Hi, folks, and welcome to Week 7 on Redress, Reconciliation, and Responsibilities. As usual, here's our list of learning objectives. Let's get into it. Okay, let's start by considering the enduring harms of the residential schools in terms of trauma. Defined simply, trauma is our normal means of relating present suffering to past violence. It's an inherently historical concept in that it involves the literal return or reliving of a past experience. In that sense, trauma necessarily means survival, which is somewhat paradoxical. For those who undergo trauma, it's not only the moment of the event, but survival itself can be a crisis. This goes beyond surviving a physical wound, encompassing a whole range of psychological injuries resulting from abuse and violence. Additionally, the concept applies not just to individuals, but to groups as well, as denoted by the notions of collective trauma or historical trauma. Yet there's a fine line between recognizing the lasting harms of the residential schools in particular, and of settler colonialism in general, and wedding psychological trauma to historical oppression to such a degree that it pathologizes indigenous identities as essentially wounded or damaged by history. Among other things, the concern is that the concept of trauma, with its historical orientation, risks losing sight of the ongoing structural violence that is causing persistent suffering of indigenous peoples in the Americas. Structural violence refers to the social structures, institutions, and relations that impair people's capabilities for meeting their fundamental human needs. So, for example, poverty results in a whole range of serious physical and psychological harms: higher risk of disease, shortened lifespans, stunted mental and emotional development, and inadequate opportunity to lead a meaningful life. These are primarily institutionally imposed harms because they are the result of the enforcement of systems of social, political, legal, and economic rules. We can see contemporary evidence of structural violence most visibly on many of the Indian reservations today out west. So check out these social indicators from Pine Ridge, the Oglala Lakota Indian Reservation in South Dakota, compared to U.S. averages. Look at suicides, for instance, with 373 suicides per 100,000 people on Pine Ridge, compared to nearly just 11 per 100,000 for the rest of the country. We also see the enduring harms of trauma manifest in the form of sexual and domestic violence, especially against Native women, both in the U.S. and Canada, where unsolved cases of murdered and missing Indigenous women remain a major problem. The ongoing structural violence faced by the Lakota in particular is instructive when considering the limits to obtaining justice in the courts of the conqueror. This goes back to the early 20th century, when the Sioux began taking initial steps for redress over the seizure of the Black Hills, inspired by new forms of activism. Thus, in 1911, an intertribal organization of Lakotas, Santee, and Arapahoes formed the Black Hills Convention, the same year that the Society for American Indians, which was a non-governmental organization run by and for Indians, lobbied Congress for redress. Congress agreed in 1920 to allow the Sioux to submit a claim to the U.S. Court of Claims, where they demanded not the return of the Black Hills, but rather just a monetary settlement. After over 20 years, the Court of Claims heard the case but dismissed it. This was just after the completion of Mount Rushmore, which was located in the Black Hills as well. In 1946, considering the participation of Native Americans in the recent war effort, the U.S. Congress established a special tribunal to address Indian land claims. This was created in part because the Court of Claims was so slow and inadequate in addressing Indian land claims. The new Indian Claims Commission received an influx of claims, thus straining the new court's mandated constitution for 10 years and resulted in a repeated series of time extensions. But in 1954, it also rejected the Black Hills claim, once again taking the government's side in the debate. Yet by the 1970s, in the midst of a new wave of transnational activism in the indigenous rights movement, the ICC heard the case and reversed its decision in 1974, deciding that Congress had not made a good faith effort to give the Lakotas the full value for their property. Yet the Justice Department appealed the decision, eventually making it all the way to the Supreme Court, which in 1980 upheld the recent rulings and awarded the Lakota $17 million in just compensation, with an additional $85 million for interest. Yet the Lakotas still haven't taken the money, as they're increasingly interested in regaining stolen land as opposed to receiving a monetary payment from the federal government. So, easily one of the poorest communities in America turned down a huge cash windfall because they see that as insufficient. So that's what I mean about the limits to justice in the courts of the conqueror. So if the Black Hills are anything to go by, then paths to redress have been blocked in the U.S. How about Canada? Why has there been relatively more movement there? The push for redress goes back at least to 1990, when Phil Fontaine, Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, a pan-tribal organization of Indian bands in Canada, publicly disclosed his experience of physical and sexual abuse while attending the Indian residential schools. By spreading awareness and destigmatizing this sensitive issue, this disclosure opened space for other survivors to come forth. Meanwhile, between 1986 and 1998, the United Church of Canada, the Anglican Church of Canada, and the Presbyterian Church in Canada each issued apologies for their involvement in the IRS system, as did some individual bishops in the Canadian Catholic Church, although the Catholic Church as a whole apologized for its role only in 2022. And in 2008, the Prime Minister of Canada issued an apology to former students on behalf of the Government of Canada for the, quote, great harm and profoundly negative and lasting impacts of the schools. Not that these apologies were perfect, but relatively more progress has been made in Canada than in the US, which is perhaps surprising, considering how similar these two countries are in terms of settler colonialism. After all, both countries used assimilative schooling to solve the so-called Indian problem, and schools in both countries were equally problematic. But for all of those similarities, the two countries have ended up in different places. Frankly, the trauma of the IRS system is a relatively much bigger public issue in Canada than in the US. As Wolford points out, survivors in Canada were more able to mobilize for reparations than those in the US. So how is it that Canada arrived at the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement in 2006, whereas redress measures in the US have been few and far between? Well, there are three reasons outlined by Wolford. First is a discursive difference, and this is based on differences in how the IRS system has been interpreted and represented in both countries. So there's been a relatively greater discursive opening in Canada, and a major reason for that concerns the proliferation of class action lawsuits. The second reason is political, and this is based on the different nature of pan-Indigenous politics and governmental Indian policy in each country. And what's interesting is that in both countries, the construction of a pan-tribal political identity was an unintended consequence of the IRS system, as well as other technologies of assimilation, such as termination and relocation policies in the 1950s. These policies moved Indians from reservations to urban centers in order to, quote, terminate federal recognition status for tribes. In the U.S., the Red Power movement forced the federal government to recognize Indigenous self-determination, but as a result of this, pan-tribal identity has been somewhat dissipated, yet it's remained somewhat stronger in Canada. For example, the Assembly of First Nations is relatively prominent in Canadian politics. This is a national advocacy organization representing First Nation citizens in Canada, which includes more than 900,000 people living in 634 First Nation communities and in cities and towns across the country. The Assembly of First Nations was instrumental in opening up greater discursive space by providing support for class action lawsuits and negotiating the eventual settlement agreement with the government in 2006. Finally, the third reason is structural, and this is based on the different characteristics of neoliberalism in the US and Canada. Neoliberalism is a political economic philosophy that gained ascendance in the 1970s, when there was a return of 19th century laissez-faire economics, policy programs involved with privatization, free trade, deregulation, fiscal austerity, restrictions in government spending, etc. So in Canada, redress was seen as a sort of one-time payment, a final settling, coming to terms with and moving on from the past. And we'll come back to the problems with that in a second. But before we get to the critiques of official redress mechanisms in Canada, let's first focus on the positives. So we have a reading this week by anthropologist Ronald Neisen, who provides an institutional ethnography of the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, abbreviated as TRC, showing how the process unfolded on the ground. This book focuses on the different types of narratives that have emerged from the TRC, as well as the concomitant power dynamics involved with the process, both in terms of survivors using the platform to articulate their grievances and to appeal for rights, as well as in terms of the government and other vested powers ensuring that the proceedings would not radically alter the status quo. Like all TRCs, there is an inherent tension between truth and reconciliation, perhaps even a trade-off. On the one hand, a more radical, deep-seated commitment to truth-telling may actually make reconciliation more difficult, especially if criminal or civil liabilities are exposed and impunity is seriously tackled. Unlike other national TRCs, such as South Africa, there's no transitional justice in Canada, where there's instead been a solid continuity of government. The Canadian TRC has no judicial powers, and therefore wasn't allowed to issue subpoenas or make any recommendations for possible civil or criminal liabilities. But these compromises were perhaps compensated by the Commission's strong public orientation, given its explicit mandate to, quote, reveal to Canadians the complex history of Indian residential schools. The Canadian TRC process was thus one of revelation, persuasion, and pedagogy. The entire process was underpinned by a strong sense of emotional reasoning stemming from injustice, what Dr. Martin Luther King called righteous indignation, or a collective sense of anger or even wrath at some perceived wrongfulness in the world that's channeled or directed into public discourse, law, and politics. In cases like this, emotions don't cloud judgments. On the contrary, the pursuit of justice is driven by emotional reasoning. And by appealing to the quasi-juridical norms, rules, and procedures of a TRC format, Indigenous peoples were able to utilize a very public platform to construct the concept of the Indian residential school, quote, survivor. Eisen talks about this under the section entitled Personhood on pages 17 to 20, where he notes the term's obvious appeal to Holocaust memory. In the Canadian TRC context, many people capitalize survivor as a proper noun, conferring a sort of honorific title as a form of respect. As with the Holocaust, the term inversely acknowledges that many people who experienced this did not survive. Many died, of course, as we were gruesomely reminded most recently in May 2021 with investigations into unmarked grave sites around residential schools. Many more were traumatized to varying degrees, and at least some of them have coalesced into this new collective identity which, again in the TRC context, was further driven by a will to testify and to bear witness, to have their voices be heard and become part of the official historical record, where it then folds into a larger pedagogical vision of reconciliation. Alright, now let's turn to some of the criticism surrounding Canada's official redress mechanisms, particularly through the form of the Canadian Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, or IRS-SA, or the Settlement Agreement, which was the result of thousands of legal cases filed against the federal government and churches, which the Assembly of First Nations folded into a class action lawsuit. The final settlement agreement was reached in 2006 and went into effect the following year, providing funding for a multi-pronged approach. It established the TRC in 2008, as well as appropriated funds for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which was an Indigenous-managed nonprofit whose mission was to provide resources to address unresolved trauma, put an end to intergenerational cycles of abuse, and enhance Indigenous people's capacity for self-determination. Additionally, the settlement agreement set up a common experience payment to be paid to all eligible former students. So it was a lump sum payment that recognized the traumatic consequences of the schools. The average payment for each eligible former student was about $28,000. Another aspect of the settlement agreement was the independent assessment process, which was an alternative dispute mechanism for dealing with claims of sexual and physical abuse. Now, the IAP may have meant well, but it was really a complex bureaucratic process that was confusing, expensive, invasive, and had the potential effect of reproducing trauma. I mean, how do you quantify trauma in terms of money? And that's the problem with this model of redress. This sort of one-time payment mentality is a bit dismissive. It's like the Canadian government just wants to be done with it, so they pay off former students in order to obtain legal closure, thereby finally freeing the government from the pesky Indian problem once and for all. In the end, the settlement agreement just reaffirmed the status quo. And think about the particular language of quote-unquote settlement, as in the IRS settlement agreement, or as in settler colonialism. Reconciliation in this context means that the wronged group is asked to reconcile themselves to existing conditions. This is why many, though not all survivors, have been critical of the reconciliation process. Some of them saw Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper's 2008 apology for the schools as too little, too late, and mostly self-serving and superficial, emphasizing Canadian nation-building at the expense of decolonization. So this is Wolford's argument, that redress and reconciliation may just be the most recent phase of settler colonialism. The goal for assimilation continues, just in a new form. We see a similar line of reasoning with a couple of readings this week from an edited volume by the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. The first essay of which is by Tiagi Alfred, a Mohawk scholar and activist whose work has geared towards Indigenous resurgence, which he posits as an alternative concept to resolution. Although not synonymous, this concept of resurgence is closely aligned with the principle of self-determination. Alfred's background as a member of the Kanawake community of Mohawk in Lower Quebec is important to understanding his political stance. This community has a long history of activism and resistance against settler colonialism, as have many other Mohawk communities, including neighboring Kanesatake, which was the site of a famous standoff between Mohawk activists and the Canadian Armed Forces over a land dispute that started when a local municipality approved the expansion of a golf course on Mohawk land. Like these Mohawk activists associated with the so-called Oka crisis, Alfred espouses a warrior ethic in scholarship, one that is confrontational in its approach to using knowledge and truth as political weapons in an ongoing struggle against the persistence of colonialism. Now, this is being a warrior in a mostly rhetorical sense, or what Anishinaabe philosopher Dale Turner calls being a word warrior. This begins to explain Alfred's radical tone in this short essay, which offers a very critical rethinking of reconciliation. He's making a similar argument to Wolford, which is that the current reconciliation process in North America is just the latest form of settler colonialism. Reconciliation is an emasculating concept, he argues, essentially just another way of solving the Indian problem through assimilation and co-option, or the neutralization of potential or active sources of resistance by subsuming them into the dominant power structure. Like the critique of the IRSSA's one-time payment mentality, the argument here is that a transactional approach to reconciliation reinscribes the logic of settler colonialism. This gets to the crux of the problem. Something was stolen, and it must be given back, he says. More to the point, reconciliation without restitution will not lead to peace and justice. There must be material reparations, particularly in the form of land. But when he says, quote, give it back, what does he mean? He's not talking about removing settler. Irredentism is not the answer. Rather, he's talking about settlers demonstrating respect for what we share. The other reading from this Aboriginal Healing Foundation volume is by Dakota scholar and activist Wazia Tawin, who provides a similar line of critique directed towards official redress mechanisms, calling for action, not mere words, in addressing the harms perpetrated against Indigenous peoples both in Canada and the US. She says that while the current initiatives in Canada are focusing on residential schools, settler society eludes responsibility for the broader harms perpetrated against Indigenous peoples by narrowing the focus of the harms to be repaired. Indeed, there's been so much focus on the sexual and physical abuse against individual students that the process has lost sight of the larger purpose of the IRS system. For example, look at the independent assessment process from the earlier slide, where harms are individualized and itemized. The underlying issues of assimilation and dispossession are largely elided, as are the underlying strands of continuity and the settler colonial logic of elimination that continue to the present. In order to fully address these issues, she gestures towards the power of activism and education in setting the path towards structural repair. The first step involves truth-telling, with an implicit belief in the transformative potential of education and the expectation that once people understand the truth, they will be compelled to act more justly. Knowledge and awareness is important, but not enough. Additional actions are needed, particularly in the form of land restoration and reparations. Now, this is a controversial demand, and it provokes settler anxiety about the sanctity of private property. But she's not calling for a violent irredentist movement, advocating for the restoration of territories. She recognizes that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people's lives are intertwined. So, it's not like settlers have to relinquish their private property rights. Rather, she's specifically calling for public lands to be returned. This would get us closer to the goal of achieving peace and justice through decolonization, or the dismantling of oppressive structures that continue to dominate Indigenous lives. That's the goal. So Tiagi Alfred and Wazia Tawin have some admittedly radical proposals, and I mean radical in the classic etymological sense of the word, meaning that they get to the root of the problem, insofar as they argue that there can be no peace and reconciliation without land restitution. But how might such a proposal invite settler counter-resistance? This question is addressed in our reading this week by Ojibwe legal scholar John Burroughs. The reading opens with a recent op-ed in a Canadian newspaper that demonstrates this settler counter-resistance against Indigenous claims and a general opposition to the politics of redress. The author claimed that contemporary non-Indigenous Canadians are, quote, blameless descendants from those who have harmed Indigenous peoples in the past. The author is insulted and even indignant to be charged with, quote, genocide. This op-ed was responding to another, previous op-ed on the opposite side of the debate, whereby a non-Indigenous Canadian was arguing that we should take responsibility for the enduring injustices suffered by Indigenous peoples. This is a very Faulkner-esque argument, that the past is never dead. In fact, it's not even past. Now, this debate covers several points of contention. So first is the cost versus benefits argument. On the settler counter-resistance side, there's little need to acknowledge the harms caused by the IRS system because the ostensible benefits of the schools outweigh the negatives, the assumption being that assimilation offered greater chances for development. Yet the other side argues that development does not have to come at the expense of culture. In fact, the destruction of culture leaves many people less adept to take advantage of opportunities for development. Second, the settler counter-resistance side argues that contemporary redress efforts impose opportunity cost that can take away from other, more pressing concerns. Yet the other side argues that the push for redress can actually provide incentives for the delivery of social services. Besides, they argue, the potentially high cost of redress shouldn't come at the expense of values. Third, the counter-resistance side argues that there is, or should be, no individual responsibility for past harms. This is the idea that we should not bear the sins of our fathers. This is a fairly typical settler move to innocence. But the other side argues that there is indeed such a thing as collective responsibility. After all, a nation is an intergenerational project, but we can't pick and choose what we want to inherit. Finally, there's the argument that by taking responsibility for enduring injustices, we can end up causing more harm than good. Frankly, we in settler society don't have a good track record when assuming responsibility for others, and redress discourse can possibly slip into a patronizing and paternalistic tone. But in fact, there have been high levels of Indigenous participation in the Canadian redress process. That must mean something. Still, it begs the question, how do we take collective responsibility for the harms of settler colonialism? Alright, and that's it. Usual assignments, keep working on your final paper, reach out to me with any questions or ideas. Anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.